I was the only one with Sauron the moment the ring was destroyed. Not a Nazgul, not one of the great captains, not a servant of any particular power or standing. Just a man, an administrator, a keeper of records who had spent 26 years making himself useful enough to keep and invisible enough to survive, and who happened to be standing in the wrong room at the right moment when the world changed. Everyone knows what happened at the end. The armies breaking, the tower falling, the Dark Lord diminishing. These things have been told and retold until they feel like things that were always going to happen, like the ending was always written and the only question was when. But I was there. I was in that chamber. And I can tell you that in those final seconds, in that brief stillness before everything ended, what I saw had nothing inevitable about it. What I saw was something that had never considered its own ending, confronting it for the first time, with nothing left to say. I have never told this to anyone. I am telling it now because I am old, and because the understanding of what I witnessed has taken most of my life to arrive at, and because it seems wrong for a man to die with something like this still unspoken. My name is Karab. I entered Barad-dur, the Black Tower of Mordor, in the service of the Dark Lord in the 43rd year of the Third Age's final century. I was 31 years old. I had been a clerk in Minas Morgul, keeping records of supply movements and troop rotations, and I had been noticed for the particular quality that got men like me noticed in the service of great powers. I was accurate, and I asked no questions. Someone whose name I never learned recommended me upward. The recommendation was accepted. I was given a pass and a set of instructions, and I walked through the gates of the Black Tower on a morning in late autumn. And I didn't walk back out through those same gates for 26 years. I want to tell you what it was like to be in the presence of Sauron at his height, before I tell you what I saw at his ending, because the ending makes no sense without the height, because what he became in those last months was only visible as a change against what he had been, and what he had been was something that I do not have adequate words for, and have spent decades failing to adequately describe. He was not in the tower constantly. He moved between the great chamber at the summit and other places I was not told about and did not ask about. But his presence was constant regardless of his physical location. Barad-dur was saturated with it, the way stone is saturated with cold, the way deep water is saturated with darkness, a pressure that had no direction because it came from everywhere, a weight on thought itself, on the simple act of forming a clear idea in your mind, and as if the air inside the tower had a specific gravity that ordinary human thinking had to push against. You adapted to it. You had to. The ones who could not adapt didn't last. Some broke quickly in the first weeks, undone by something they could not name and could not fight, because it was not attacking them in any way they knew how to defend against. And some lasted longer, before whatever was holding them together gave way under the sustained pressure of being in proximity to something so far beyond human scale that the proximity itself became a kind of erosion. I watched men I had worked alongside for months simply stop one day. Not die. Stop. Sit down in the middle of a corridor or a workroom and not get up again. The infirmary had a particular ward for them, and we did not discuss what happened to the ones who went there. Well, the ones who survived were the ones who found a way to make the pressure feel like weather, like something that was simply the condition of the place, rather than an active assault on their capacity to remain themselves. I found my way by concentrating on the work. Numbers, lists, supply routes, the specific, uncountable details of administering an army of hundreds of thousands across a territory that spanned from the Ash Mountains to the plains of Gorgoroth. There was always more work than time to do it, and I discovered that losing myself in the work was not just productive, but protective. A man who is counting sacks of grain is a man whose mind is occupied with something precise and finite and real, and precision and finitude and reality were useful things to hold on to in Barad-dur. I remember a period in my 9th year when I was given responsibility for auditing the grain stores in the lower-level depots. A task that took 11 weeks and produced a document of 412 pages that precisely nobody would ever read. I remember those 11 weeks as among the most stable of my time in the tower. The work was meaningless in every sense that mattered. It contributed nothing to any war or campaign or strategic objective, but for 11 weeks I had a clear task with a clear completion and a clear standard of accuracy. And I held on to all three of those things the way a man in deep water holds on to anything solid. And when the 11 weeks were finished, and the document was filed in a room where it would gather dust until the tower fell, which it eventually did, I was still myself, still intact, still functional. That was what the work gave me, and I have never found a better way to explain what it cost to be in that place, and what it cost to remain in it, and what the price of that remaining was. And I learned other things too over the years. I learned to keep my eyes forward, and my expression neutral, and my pace consistent, because anything that marked you as thinking too hard about your surroundings attracted attention you did not want. I learned which corridors to avoid, at which hours, and which servants were safe to speak with briefly, and which ones had been in the tower long enough that something behind their eyes had changed in ways that made even brief exchanges dangerous. And I learned the rhythms of the place the way a sailor learns the rhythms of weather, not because he can change them, but because knowing them is the difference between survival and its absence. The great chamber I knew from the 40 or so occasions I was summoned there. It was vast in a way that architecture alone could not account for, the darkness at its edges behaving differently from ordinary darkness, was as if the shadows themselves were a material that the room was constructed from rather than simply the absence of light. The palantír sat on a plinth at the chamber's center, a stone the size of a man's head, dark and still when not in use, and when in use, producing a quality of light that I will not attempt to describe, except to say that it was not any color I had a name for, and that looking at it directly, for more than a moment, produced a sensation at the back of the skull that I associated with things being read that were not meant to be read. I saw Sauron directly, perhaps 40 times in 26 years. These were not conversations. He did not speak to men like me. What happened was that I would be summoned, or would enter the great chamber for some administrative purpose, and he would be present, and I would deliver my report or leave my documents and withdraw, and during this process I would exist in the same space as something that made every other experience of power I had ever had feel like a child's approximation of the concept. The closest thing I can compare it to is standing at the edge of a cliff in high wind. The wind does not want to destroy you. It is not malicious. It simply exists at a scale that makes your continued existence a matter of your own management, rather than anything the wind concerns itself with. Sauron was like that. Not cruel in any personal sense. Not interested in me as a thing to be cruel to. I was furniture. I was a function. I was one of the thousands of small working parts that kept the apparatus of his will moving in the world, and I was beneath his notice in the way that the stones in the floor were beneath his notice, present and necessary and entirely unconsidered. There was one occasion, in my 14th year, when I made an error. A minor one by any reasonable standard, a transposition in a supply manifest that had no material consequence, because the discrepancy was caught by a checking process before any goods moved. I corrected it and resubmitted and thought nothing more of it. 3 days later, I was summoned to the Great Chamber, not for a regular administrative report, but for a specific accounting of the error. I stood in that room and I explained what had happened, the transposition, the check, the correction, and I felt, for the first time in my years there, the full and specific weight of that attention directed at me rather than at the room I happened to be in. Not the ambient pressure of his presence, the actual, particular, more targeted attention of a mind that was in that moment entirely focused on me and the thing I had done. I was not punished. The error was insufficient to warrant it, and I think even then he knew that, and had already calculated the cost of replacing me against the cost of the attention he was spending. But I understood something from those 3 minutes in the Great Chamber that I had not understood before. The indifference that had always felt like safety was not indifference. It was simply low priority, and low priority in a place like that was the best possible condition you could occupy and the most fragile. That was the height of it. That was what he was when I arrived, and what he remained for most of my time there. The patience most of all. I have tried to explain Sauron's patience to people who were not there, and I have always failed, because the word patience implies an active quality, implies a person waiting for something, holding themselves in check, a deferring gratification. What he had was nothing like that. It was the patience of geology, of continental drift, of stars. Not restraint, but the simple absence of any relationship with time that would have made impatience possible. He had been working toward his purposes for 3,000 years. And 3,000 years was simply the period that the work had taken, and would continue to take, as long as it took. And the question of whether this was a long time or a short time was a question that did not exist in any framework he operated within. This was what made Barad-dur feel permanent. Not the stone, not the armies, not the power radiating through every surface of the place. The certainty that the mind at the center of it had a relationship with time that made the concept of its ending functionally unthinkable. Men ended. Ages ended. Sauron reorganized and recalculated and continued. I believed this. I believed it, the way you believe the sun will rise. And then, in the final year, I began to watch it change. The first sign was the palantír, the seeing stone he kept in the Great Chamber. He had always used it. It was a tool of communication and intelligence, a means of projecting his will across distance, of observing the movements of his enemies and coordinating the movements of his servants. I knew this from the logistics of it, from the timing of decisions that correlated with his sessions at the stone, from the way information moved through the tower in the days after he had looked into it. What changed was the quality of his use of it, the frequency first. Sessions that had occurred perhaps weekly began occurring daily, and then multiple times in a single day. Then something else, harder to name, that I noticed from the pattern of what followed each session. Before, the palantír produced decisions. Intelligence gathered, response calculated, orders issued. That was the rhythm. After the change, the sessions began producing something different, a quality of stillness in the tower that was not the stillness of calculation, a tension in the servants who carried messages from the Great Chamber that was not the ordinary tension of carrying messages in a place where the penalty for error was severe. No, something that I filed away and observed and did not name for 3 weeks before I was honest with myself about what it was. He was searching for something he could not find. I understood this from the particulars. The timing of his searches correlated with nothing outside the tower that I could identify. No enemy movement, no intelligence report, no strategic development that would have prompted a renewed focus. But they were irregular and urgent in a way his use of the stone had never been irregular or urgent before. And the stillness that followed them was the stillness of a search that had not found its object, the particular quality of a mind that has looked and not seen the thing it was looking for. What was he looking for? I did not know then. I have understood it since. He could feel the ring. 3,000 years of his own power poured into that object meant he had always felt it, or a faint, persistent signal at the edge of consciousness, the way a man can sometimes feel his own heartbeat without having to concentrate on it. What had changed was the signal's quality. The ring had left Rivendell with its bearer months before. It was moving purposefully, by a route he could trace in general but not specifically, and the mind carrying it was invisible to him in a way that no mind should have been invisible, in a way that produced in him, each time he searched, the same result. Presence felt, location unknown, bearer unidentifiable. This was the thing that had introduced urgency into geological patience. Not any single threat he could measure. The unmeasurable one. The thing he could feel but couldn't see, moving through his world on a path his vast intelligence couldn't fully model, carrying the object that was the condition of his existence. I watched him learn to manage this. Or try to. The sessions with the stone became disciplined again, scheduled, controlled. The quality of his decision-making recovered its characteristic long-range certainty. If anything, his strategic boldness increased in this period, the armies committed to the west, the pressure applied on multiple fronts simultaneously, the kind of sprawling, coordinated campaign that only a mind able to hold 1,000 variables in clarity could execute. To anyone observing the outputs of Barad-dur in this period, not everything was proceeding with typical devastating competence. I was not observing the outputs. I was inside. And inside, the thing I had noticed remained. The searching. The stillness after the searching. The particular quality of a mind managing something it had not had to manage before. Then came the morning of the confrontation in the stone. I did not witness it directly. I witnessed what followed. Sauron emerged from the session differently than he had ever emerged from any session before, and not dramatically. The power radiating through the tower did not spike or fluctuate. His subsequent decisions were coherent and swiftly made. To any external observer, nothing had changed. But I had been in Barad-dur for 23 years at this point. I had survived by reading the room with a precision that most men in my position didn't develop, because most men in my position didn't last long enough to develop it. And what I read in the room in the hours after that session was something I had never read there before. He had seen Aragorn, the heir of Isildur, in the stone. The man had revealed himself deliberately, as a challenge, as a statement. And in the seeing, Sauron had processed the implications at a speed I could only infer from the decisions that followed. The accelerated timeline. The armies moved up. The plans revised and sharpened. All of this was characteristic. All of this was the geological mind, updating its calculations and adjusting its campaign. What was not characteristic was the quality underneath the decisions. the thing I could feel in the changed pressure of the air in the tower, that day, that week, that month. I had spent years learning to read his certainty as weather, as the permanent condition of the place. What I was reading now was something else. Not uncertainty exactly. Not doubt in any form a human mind would recognize as doubt, but something colder and more specific. He had believed, because his nature made it difficult to believe otherwise, that if someone had the ring, they would use it, would try to master him with it, to turn his own power against him. This was the threat he had always modeled. This was the threat that Aragorn's revelation had seemed to confirm, and he had responded to that threat with everything he had committed his armies, had moved his timeline forward, or had done exactly what 3,000 years of strategic intelligence told him was the correct response. And somewhere underneath that response, something else had happened. The thing he could not quite see, could not quite look at directly, had become fractionally more visible. Not the ring itself, the mind carrying the ring, the path it was on, the direction it had always been going. Not toward power, not toward use, toward the fire. I do not know if he consciously understood this in that period. I only know what I observed in the air of the tower. Something had shifted in the foundation of his certainty. A hairline fracture in the geological patience. Not enough to change his actions, he had committed to the campaign, and the campaign continued with all his characteristic force and coordination. But something underneath the force and coordination that had not been there before. He had, or for perhaps the first time in 3,000 years, become afraid of the answer to a question he could not stop asking. The final weeks were the hardest to watch. I had a colleague in those weeks, a man named Derek, who had been in the tower almost as long as I had, and who managed the correspondence between Barad-dur and the field commanders at the Black Gate. We did not speak much in the ordinary way of colleagues. It was not that kind of place, but we had developed over the years the particular wordless understanding of two men who have survived the same conditions long enough to recognize something of themselves in each other. In the final weeks, Derek began to look the way men looked before they went to the infirmary ward. Not broken yet, but bending. I asked him once, in a corridor, in the particular shorthand we had developed, what was happening in the correspondence from the gate. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said the commanders were requesting things that had not been requested before. Not more soldiers, not more weapons, more time. The commanders at the Black Gate were being asked to hold a position against a Western force that the numbers did not support holding against, a force so small by the standards of what Mordor could field that its presence there made no military sense. The army of the West was a fraction of the size of Mordor's forces. It had no business being at the Black Gate, and yet there it was, and the commanders could not understand why it was there or what it expected to accomplish, and neither, Derek said, very quietly, could anyone in the tower. I understood then, more clearly than I had before, what was happening. The army at the gate was not there to win. It was there to be looked at, to fill the stone, to give Sauron something to focus on while something else moved in the south, somewhere in the geography between the mountains and the fire, along a path too small and too quiet to register against the noise of the great armies arrayed before the gate. The Western commanders knew something about where the ring was, or suspected, and they were betting everything, their lives and their armies, and the fate of their world, on Sauron's inability to look away from what they were showing him. I said nothing. I went back to my records and kept counting. The Mouth of Sauron returned from the parley at the gate in those final weeks, and passed through the tower, and I saw him once in a corridor, and the look on his face was something I hadn't seen on the face of any senior servant before. Not fear, not satisfaction. Something that belonged to a man who has delivered a message that was meant to be a declaration of victory, and has registered somewhere underneath the performance of that message, or that the performance isn't landing the way it was intended to. That the men across the divide at the gate were not broken by what he showed them, were not collapsing, were still there, still standing, with a quality in their stillness that did not read like men without options. He passed me without acknowledgement, which was normal, but I saw his face before he composed it, in the half-second before he registered my presence in the corridor, and what I saw in it in that half-second was a man who has delivered his master's greatest threat, and found the threat insufficient, and does not yet know what that means, but knows that it means something. I did not sleep the night before the last day. I lay in my quarters and listened to the tower, and what I heard was the tower at a frequency I had not heard before. Not louder. Different. The way metal sounds different when it is under more stress than it was built to carry. A quality in the stone and the air that I could not name, except as wrongness. Something that had been the permanent condition of the place for 26 years, behaving in a way that it was not supposed to behave. I got up before dawn and prepared my documents, and walked up through the tower toward the great chamber, and I did not think about what I had heard in the night, and I did not think about the army at the gate or the thing moving in the south, and I thought about the supply figures and the numbers I would need to present, and the procedure I had followed 40 times before. I walked into the chamber and found Sauron at the stone. The room was quieter than I had ever felt it. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of the pressure that had always been the chamber's defining characteristic. Something was different about the air. I noticed it, and filed it, and took my position at the appropriate distance, and waited to be acknowledged, as I had always waited. He did not acknowledge me. He was deep in the stone. I stood and I waited, and I noticed the quality of the room's silence, and I did not think about what it meant. And then everything stopped. I cannot describe what happened in those seconds in the language of ordinary sequence, because sequence is a property of time, and time did something in that chamber that it does not normally do. The closest I can come is this. There was a moment, and in the moment, everything that had been the condition of Barad-dur for 26 years, the pressure, the weight, the geological certainty, the sense of a will so vast it had become environmental, simply ceased, between one breath and the next, as if something that had been the permanent temperature of the place had been extinguished. Sauron moved back from the stone. I had never seen him move like that before. He had always moved with the deliberate economy of something that exists at a scale where urgency is not a category. What I watched now was different. A withdrawal, a stumbling back in a form that had forgotten how to be unsure of its footing because it had never needed to be. His great form diminishing even as I watched, not physically, not yet, but in some quality I had no name for, the specific, visible quality of a thing whose certainty has been removed from underneath it. And then he turned. He turned and he looked at me. 26 years. 40 occasions in the same room. And he had never once looked at me. I was furniture. I was a function. I was so far beneath the threshold of his consideration that my presence had registered the way the stones in the floor registered. He looked at me. I cannot tell you what his face was in that moment. I have tried for the rest of my life to find the words. and the words have never been adequate. What I can tell you is what it was not. It was not the terrible vast certainty I had spent 26 years surviving. It was not the contemptuous indifference of a geological will acknowledging furniture. What I saw was naked, 3,000 years of constructed certainty, stripped in a single second. And underneath it, something that I recognized the way you recognize a thing you have seen on human faces your whole life, but never expected to see here. Something small and specific and absolutely fundamental, and something that all his vast intelligence and all his terrible patience and all the 3,000 years of careful building had been erected on top of, and had been covering so completely that I had never imagined it was there. He was terrified. Not of me. Not of anything in the room. Of what the cessation of the pressure meant. Of what he had felt in the stone, in the moment before he stepped back. Of the understanding arriving even now, in those 2 or 3 or 4 seconds of stillness, or of what had happened in a crack in a mountain far away. The ring was gone. Not taken. Not used. Gone. Destroyed. And with it the foundation of everything he was. He looked at me, and I understood, in the wordless communication of those locked eyes, that he was looking at me because I was the only living thing in the room, because something in him needed a witness, but because 3,000 years of being so far beyond human scale that humans did not register as real had ended in this chamber in this moment, and the nearest living thing to him was a small man with a stack of administrative documents who had been standing quietly waiting to be noticed, and who was, it turned out, the last thing he would ever see that had eyes to see him back. I saw his fear. I held it. 2 seconds. 3. 4. I could not look away, and he did not look away. And in that stillness, I understood things about him that no amount of proximity had given me before. The dependency that the ring had always represented. Not just power, not just capability, but the deepest condition of his continued existence. Something he had poured so much of himself into, over so long, that its absence was not the loss of a tool, but the removal of the ground on which he stood. I understood why the patience had thinned in those final months. Or not because he had miscalculated, but because some part of him had known, in a way he could not permit himself to fully acknowledge, that the thing he could not see in the stone was going exactly where it was going, that the mind he could not read had a purpose he could not model, that the one possibility his vast intelligence had always treated as effectively impossible was the one that was true. He had been afraid for months. He had covered it with campaigns and decisions and the tremendous machinery of his will moving in the world. And now the covering was gone, and what was underneath was visible, and what was underneath was not the dark lord of history and legend and 3,000 years of terror. It was just fear. Ancient and total, and, for those few seconds, completely, terribly human. Then he came apart. Not violently, not dramatically, not in the way the towers falling would be dramatic. The opposite of dramatic. The diminishing of a presence so vast that its disappearance left a silence in the room unlike any silence I had ever been in. A silence with the specific quality of enormous absence, of a space that had been full of something for so long that the fullness had become the room's definition, and its removal left something that was not quite silence, and not quite anything else I had a name for. A residue. For a few seconds, a residue of what he had been, thinning in the air of the great chamber like smoke dispersing in a wind that was not there. And then the tower began to move. I will not dwell on the getting out. It was long and it was dark, and it was luck as much as knowledge, though the knowledge helped. I had spent 26 years in that building, and I knew corridors that most men who served there did not know. Exits used for administrative rather than military purposes. Routes that were clear when the main passages were choked with the chaos of a structure whose foundations were deciding to be somewhere else. I ran. I did not look back at the chamber, or at what remained in it, or at anything except the next corridor, and the next decision, and the one after that. I came out into Gorgoroth on a plain covered in the debris of an army that had simply stopped. Not defeated, stopped. Orcs sitting where they had been standing, or looking at their hands, or at the ground, or at nothing. The particular blankness of something that has been animated by a will that is no longer present and doesn't know what to do with the absence. I walked through them, and none of them looked at me, and I kept walking until I was away from the worst of it. And then I sat down and looked back at what had been Barad-dur. The tower was gone. The great structure had folded into itself, stone on stone, into a mass of rubble on the plateau that had once been the center of the world's darkness. Gone as if it had never been. The plain around it was quiet in the way that places are quiet after something enormous has ended. A quality of silence that is not peaceful, but exhausted. The silence of a held breath finally released. I thought about Derek. I did not know if he had gotten out. I never found out, but I thought about the men I had worked alongside for years, and how many of them were in the armies at the gate, and how many of those were still standing now that the will directing them had gone. I thought about 26 years of careful invisibility and precise record-keeping, and the particular discipline of surviving a place by making myself into furniture. And I thought about how all of that had delivered me to a room at exactly the wrong moment, or exactly the right one, depending on how you chose to understand what had happened there. I sat there for a long time. I thought about the men in the armies, the ones I had processed supply requisitions for over 26 years, the hundreds of thousands of soldiers whose existence I had known only through numbers and movement orders, and the administrative arithmetic of feeding and equipping a force of that scale. They had not chosen to be there, most of them, any more than I had chosen to be there, and not in any meaningful sense of the word choosing. They had been born into the shadow of the tower, or conscripted into it, or arrived under circumstances that left them no viable alternative. And now, whatever had animated them, the will that had given their existence its shape and direction and terrible purpose, was gone. And they were sitting on plains and in corridors and at gates, holding weapons that no longer had a target, looking at hands that had been directed by something else for so long they had perhaps forgotten what it meant to direct them themselves. I wondered if any of them felt what I was feeling. This specific disorientation of something that has been a permanent condition of your existence, simply ceasing, and the strange quality of the silence it leaves behind, which is not peaceful and not triumphant, and is not anything you have a ready word for. People have asked me, in the years since, what the fall of Sauron felt like, whether it felt like victory, whether I felt relief or joy or the particular euphoria of a darkness lifting. I have never known how to answer honestly without disappointing them. The honest answer is that what I felt, sitting on that plain looking at the rubble of the tower I had spent 26 years inside, was not any of those things. What I felt was the specific, disorienting quality of understanding something I had not understood before, or something that 26 years of proximity to vast power and 4 seconds of looking into its eyes as it ended had given me that I could not have gotten any other way. He had been afraid the whole time. Not the way men are afraid, not in the specific, mortal way of creatures who know they can be ended and carry that knowledge with them through their days. Something older and deeper. The specific fear of something that has made itself utterly dependent on an object in the world and has spent 3,000 years managing that dependency, and has known, in some unacknowledged depth of itself, that the dependency was the flaw at the foundation of everything it had built. He had poured himself into the ring because the pouring was the only way to achieve what he wanted to achieve, and in the pouring he had created the condition of his own end and had spent 3,000 years covering that condition with armies and campaigns and the tremendous sustained performance of invincible certainty. The patience was real. The intelligence was real. The power was real. But underneath them, always, was the thing I saw in those 4 seconds. The thing that his vast will had been holding in place for as long as he had existed in the world, in the form he had chosen. A small, specific, and absolute terror of the one thing he couldn't control, the one motivation he couldn't model, the willingness to carry the most powerful object in the world to the edge of a fire and let it go. This is what ended him. Not armies, not great powers arrayed against him. A small person with no desire for what they carried, walking toward a fire. A motivation so alien to everything he was that he could feel it moving in the world for months and could not see it, because seeing it required understanding it, and understanding it required imagining a mind that wanted nothing from power, that found the ring not tempting but burdensome, that would choose destruction over use. He could not imagine that mind, and the thing he couldn't imagine killed him. I think about those 4 seconds often. The eyes, and what was in them. The nakedness of it. The way 3,000 years of terrible power resolved at its ending as into something so recognizable and so small. I am an old man. I have had most of a lifetime to think about what I saw in that chamber. What I keep returning to is this. He was not diminished by his ending. He was revealed by it. Everything he had been for 3,000 years, the armies, the tower, the rings of power, the vast coordinated campaigns of domination, all of it was real, and all of it was, at the same time, the elaborate structure a terrified thing had built to cover the terror, to make itself feel like something that could not end. He ended. In 4 seconds, in a room in a tower that no longer exists, with a man he had never noticed holding his last look. He ended. And what was there in the ending was not the god of history and legend, just the fear that the god of history and legend had always been built on top of. I was the only man with Sauron the moment the ring was destroyed. Now you know what I saw.